Okay, so we're going to unpack a 1991 cold case, the murder of 15-year-old Jessica Keane in Madison County, Ohio.
Wow.
And get this, the murder weapon was a tombstone, like an actual pioneer-era tombstone
A
from
tombstone.
a cemetery.
Wow, that's chilling.
Yeah, it's super creepy. We're getting all this from an episode of Anatomy of Murder.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's a true crime podcast, and they really go into all the details of this investigation, and it's fascinating.
So what makes this case so special? I mean, aside from the whole tombstone thing.
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
It all comes down to DNA evidence, but back then the technology was pretty limited.
Right, like the early days of DNA testing.
Yeah, exactly. It took almost 2 decades to actually get a match.
17 years.
Can you imagine waiting that long for answers?
It's hard to fathom.
It makes you think, what if this happened in our town? Would we have to wait that long for justice?
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Back in 91, in a small rural community like Madison County, where violent gun was probably pretty rare.
Right.
This must have been absolutely terrifying for everyone.
Oh, totally. The podcast really paints this picture of Jessica as this bright and well-liked teenager, but she was living in a halfway house because of some family issues.
Oh, wow.
And she had this boyfriend, Sean, and they had plans to meet the night she disappeared.
So naturally, he was a suspect.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The initial investigation really focused on the cemetery where they found Jessica's body.
Oh, okay.
There were signs of a struggle, and later they found her jeans miles away on a highway on-ramp.
So it seemed like maybe she was abducted.
Right, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And of course, suspicion fell on Sean and his friends. But the thing is, DNA testing back then wasn't what it is today.
Yeah, they probably had very limited samples to work with.
Exactly. And every test they ran used up a portion of that sample. So they had to be really careful about who they tested.
It must have been such a tough decision for investigators, knowing that every test could potentially use up valuable evidence.
Right. And meanwhile, Jessica's family and the whole community are just waiting and worrying.
Yeah, that's got to be agonizing.
Totally. Every year, the local paper would publish these articles about Jessica on the anniversary of her death.
Just a constant reminder that her killer was still out there.
Exactly. And then finally, in 2008, 17 years to the day after Jessica's murder, the county prosecutor, Stephen Pronay, gets a phone call.
Okay.
A DNA match.
Wow.
They finally had a suspect, Marvin Lee Smith, and guess what? He had a history of similar crimes.
Oh, no.
And get this, he was actually incarcerated in Madison County when Jessica was murdered.
Wait, so he was in prison at the time?
Yep. Pretty crazy, right? So the podcast goes on to talk about how they finally get to interview Smith, and they kind of go in expecting him to deny knowing Jessica.
Like a strategy.
Yeah, exactly. They figured they could use his denial against him.
It makes sense. Play on his confidence, hoping he'll slip up.
Right, and that's exactly what happens when they confront him with the DNA evidence. He totally can't explain it away.
Oh, wow. So he didn't confess outright?
No, but his denial was basically an admission.
I think that's called a negative confession, right?
Yeah, maybe. So it's this glaring contradiction. He's not admitting guilt, but he can't explain away the evidence either.
Powerful stuff.
So eventually, Smith pleads guilty, avoids a trial, and gets life without parole justice served, you would think, right?
Right.
But here's the thing. He never explains his actions. Why Jessica? Why that night?
So many unanswered questions.
It's really unsettling, We're left with this feeling that we may never fully understand what drove him to do it.
That's true. There's a lot we still don't know about this case.
Exactly. We've got this small town, a brutal murder, a case that goes cold for years, and then bam, DNA technology comes along, and suddenly there's a lead justice is served, but not without leaving some deep scars on the community and, of course, on Jessica's family.
It really makes you think about the impact these kinds of cases have on everyone involved.
It's a lot to unpack for sure, and I think there's a lot more to discuss here. How much can we really rely on forensic science? And what are the limitations we need to be aware of?
Definitely, those are important questions to consider.
And we also need to think about the impact these cases have on everyday people like you and me. How do they change our perception of safety and justice?
Yeah, that's a big one.
So I think we should delve into all of that a bit further, don't you?
Absolutely.
I'm ready to dive deeper.
17 years without answers. It's just mind-boggling. Did investigators even think about, future advancements in DNA technology?
Yeah, that's a good question. You got to remember, back in the early 90s, DNA tech was brand new.
Right.
It was this powerful tool, but nobody really knew how to use it to its full potential,
I see.
So imagine you're an investigator. You've got this tiny sample of Jessica's DNA.
Hmm.
Every test you run uses up a chunk of it.
Right.
And in the back of your mind, there's this thought like, what if technology gets better in a few years? What if I could get more information from that same sample with newer techniques?
Oh, wow, that's got to be frustrating.
Totally. It's like this balancing act between using what you have now and preserving it for the future. And the whole time the community is living with this unsolved trauma, the podcast mentioned how people were scared to let their kids out of their sight.
Yeah, I bet it created this like cloud of suspicion. Everyone's a potential suspect.
It makes you wonder about the psychological toll, right? Like, I remember when I was a kid, there was a break-in on our street, and I was terrified to sleep alone for months.
Oh, wow.
And that wasn't even a violent crime. Can you imagine living with the fear of an unsolved murder in your town for almost 2 decades?
It's like a wound that never heals every time it's in the news. Every anniversary, it just brings back all the pain and uncertainty.
Especially for Jessica's family.
Absolutely. Knowing her killer was out there somewhere, potentially living a normal life.
Ugh, it's heartbreaking. And then when they finally get that DNA match in 2008 identifying Marvin Lee Smith, I can't even imagine that mix of emotions.
Relief, anger, sadness, maybe even guilt.
Yeah, all of that. But that DNA match, it wasn't just a break in the case, it was a turning point for the whole community.
Totally. Suddenly there's a name, a face to the fear.
Right, and with Smith's arrest, I bet there was a huge sense of relief.
Definitely a sense of closure starting to emerge.
But even with the conviction, there are still so many unanswered questions. Smith never confessed, never explained why he targeted Jessica.
He just pleaded guilty and accepted his sentence.
Like a missing piece of the puzzle.
And that missing piece, the why, it can be really frustrating. We want to understand what motivates someone to do something so horrific.
We try to make sense of the senseless.
Right, but sometimes those answers just aren't there, and we have to accept that some acts of violence defy explanation.
It's a disturbing thought that darkness can exist anywhere, even in seemingly ordinary people.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we don't always have all the answers.
We've talked about the community, the investigators, but what about Jessica's family? How do you think they coped with this for so many years?
I can't even imagine the constant waiting, the not knowing, the fear that they might never get answers.
And then after 17 years, they get a conviction, but still no real understanding of why?
It's hard to fathom, but it also makes you appreciate the resilience of the human spirit, how people can face such darkness and still find a way to move forward.
To honor their loved one's memory, to advocate for justice, they never gave up hope.
And that's something we can all learn from their story. You know, even in the face of tragedy, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of healing.
Finding meaning in the midst of loss, fighting for what's right, no matter how long it takes.
It's really inspiring.
Their story and the advancements in DNA technology make me think about how much our understanding of justice has changed over time.
Oh, that's a great point. The fact that Jessica's case was solved after 17 years, thanks to DNA, raises this question of how has this reliance on DNA technology changed our perception of justice?
And what are its limitations?
Exactly. These are important things to consider.
We've been talking about DNA evidence and how it helped solve Jessica's case after so long. It's amazing what science can do, but it also makes you wonder, like, how much should we rely on DNA evidence alone?
Yeah, it's a good point. DNA is powerful, but it's not like foolproof. You know,
Right, it's not like in the movies where they find a hair and instantly they know everything.
exactly. We've seen cases where there's been contamination or even like misinterpretation of the results.
And that's led to wrongful convictions.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Wow, that's scary. So it's not just about the science itself, but also the people handling the evidence, right?
Absolutely. The human element is huge. You need skilled professionals who are super careful about how they collect and analyze and interpret the data.
Right. Even the smallest mistake could have huge consequences.
It's true, and it reminds us that even with amazing technology, we still need those checks and balances, you know?
Right. We can't just blindly trust the science. We have to be critical of the evidence.
For sure.
It's like to err is human rights.
Definitely.
And when it comes to murder investigations, those errors can be devastating.
Absolutely. That's why we need a system that allows for appeals for second opinions, for people to constantly be checking the evidence.
You know, thinking about Jessica's family, it's unimaginable what they must have gone through all those years, not knowing who was responsible.
It's heartbreaking.
And even when they get the conviction, it's still not a complete resolution, you know?
Right. There are still unanswered questions, and the pain of their loss is always going to be there.
It makes you realize that justice is complicated. It's not just about catching the bad guy and putting them in jail.
It's about so much more. It's about healing, finding peace and honoring the victim's memory.
And what about the community? They lived under the shadow of this unsolved crime for 17 years when Smith was arrested. It must have been a huge relief for everyone.
Oh, absolutely. Unsolved crimes, they create this feeling of unease and vulnerability.
Yeah, like this weight hanging over the town.
And when the case is solved, it lifts that weight and people can finally breathe again.
It makes you realize that even if we don't personally know the victim, these crimes, they affect us all, you know?
They really do. They challenge our sense of security and make us think about our own safety.
It makes the work that investigators and prosecutors do so important.
Oh, absolutely. They're not just solving crimes. They're helping to restore a sense of peace to the whole community.
Like Stephen Pronai in Jessica's case.
Exactly. Their dedication is incredible. They're the ones who never give up, who keep pushing until they find the truth.
And it seems like they're using DNA evidence more and more these days.
Oh, for sure. We see it all the time. Cold cases being cracked thanks to advancements in DNA technology.
It's amazing, but like we've been talking about, it's not perfect. There are still ethical questions to consider.
Right, like how much should we rely on it? What are the risks of misuse?
Tough questions that we as a society need to figure out.
Especially as technology keeps advancing.
I think this deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with a murder case, but we've talked about so much more.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
We've touched on the limitations of DNA technology, the impact of unsolved crimes, the human element in all of this, and how our idea of justice is constantly evolving.
It's a complex issue for sure.
So as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this thought. The next time you hear about a crime solved with DNA evidence, think about the bigger picture, the science, the ethics, the human stories behind it all.
It's more than just a headline.
It's about people's lives, about justice, and about our understanding of right and wrong in a world that's getting more and more complicated every day.